Om Sato Ma Sadgamaya Tamaso Ma Jyotirgamaya Mrityurmamritam Gamaya Aviravir Maedhi Rudrayate Dakshinam Mukham Tena Mam Pahi Nityam Tena Mam Pahi Nityam. Lead us from the unreal to the real. Lead us from darkness unto light. Lead us from death to immortality. Reach us through and through ourselves, O Lord, and protect us evermore from ignorance by thy sweet, compassionate face. Vishnurva Tripurantako Bhavatu Va Brahma Surendrotha Va Bhanurva Shashalakshanota Bhagavan Buddhota Siddhota Va Ragadvesha Visharti Moharahita Sattvanukampodhyato Yasarvai Saha Samskrito Gunaganais Tasmai Namah Sarvada. The Supreme Reality and its messengers are known by various names in various traditions. But as for me, I offer my worship always to the one going by any name and belonging to any tradition, who is free from attachment and hatred, free from worldliness and delusion, who is filled with compassion towards all living beings, and who is possessed of all noble virtues. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat. Om, peace, peace, peace be unto us and to all the beings of the universe. So this morning, my topic is science and spirituality. So first off, let me say that I'm not a scientist. So then one may wonder, well, what business do I have speaking about science and spirituality? I've studied spirituality, so why not just speak about that? Why bring science into it when I'm not a scientist? That would be true if I were proposing to teach physics or chemistry or biology or cosmology, astrophysics, or something like that. To speak about such subjects when I don't know anything about them or don't know much about them more than an amateur would be absurd. But to understand the phenomenon of science and the phenomenon of spirituality, that doesn't take a deep education and a thorough education in the sciences in order to understand the phenomena of the science and of spirituality. So I'm speaking from that perspective of someone who has thought deeply about the issues connected to spirituality and science and the confrontation between the two. So another title for this talk could be, Can One Be Both Scientific and Spiritual? That's already the title of a small booklet by Swami Buddharanaji. But I'm not really going to talk about can one be both science and spiritual. That will be obvious from the talk itself that one can. But I'm going to talk more about the two phenomena, the scientific search and the spiritual search, and religion as the embodiment of the spiritual search. As many of you know, maybe all of you know, the fastest growing religious community, and it's not a community because there's no organization to it by definition, but the religious group in the U.S. now are those who are, SBNRs. Everybody has an acronym nowadays, so these people have to have an acronym too. So they are SBNRs, spiritual but not religious. That is, those who don't like organized religion, don't like to categorize themselves as I am Christian, I am Hindu, I am Buddhist, I am whatever, but who believe that there is the possibility of spiritual experience. So they're interested in the essence of spirituality. And actually, this isn't the topic, so I won't develop it. I'll just mention it. Swami Vivekananda and Sri Ramakrishna, but in an explicit way, Swami Vivekananda was really the one who initiated the SBNR movement, the spiritual but not religious movement. So, one of the reasons why the spiritual but not religious movement has become so strong, or again, it's not a movement, it's individuals who don't like movements, especially religious ones. But the reason why there are so many people turning in that direction is because of the abuses of institutions, of institutionalized religion and so forth, and the control that religion in certain forms has exerted over people. So anyway, I'm going to speak about science and spirituality this morning. And one of my initial questions in my own life when I was a teenager. From the time I was 13, I suddenly became interested in science. I wasn't interested in anything before 13. I hated school, hated everything about school, resented every minute I had to sit in school, and was one of those kids who spent his time looking out the window daydreaming. And it was because of kids like me that they started designing schools later without windows. But I would have found something else to stare at, so that didn't do any good. But when I was 13, I was lucky to have a good science teacher and a good math teacher, and I fell in love with both. The first time I fell in love with studies. And so early on, I found that religion as I had been taught it, and science as I had been taught it, the two were in conflict. That the two didn't sit easily with each other. And that, of course, is especially true in the West, more so than in India, as I'll explain. Though in India, the conflict has come there also, but in a different way. But in the West, there was this conflict between, or has been, still is, this conflict between religion and science, the two opposed camps. And so one of my early questions was, can they both go together? Or does one have to win out over the other, and one be rejected in favor of the other? And so that was an early question of mine. And when I found my first book on Vedanta when I was 17, living in Sweden as a student, one of the things that fascinated me with the tradition, one of several things, but one of the main themes that really turned me in this direction was the idea that there's the conflict between religion and between spirituality and science is unnecessary. That the two can be harmonious. So it's on that basis that I have for a long time taken an interest in the subject. So let me take up a brief historical note as we go forward and say, as I've said on occasion here before, that from the beginning, from humanity's beginnings, long before history, before there are any recorded documents, every human society, even so-called primitive early societies, human beings have always been both religious and scientific. If you take science as trying to understand what all of this is, what is this? What is this? What is this? What is this? What are the heavens? People have been interested in that from the time they first human beings opened their eyes. We don't know really if a dog has such questions. We don't know if a cat has such questions. In fact, some people who make a distinction, and a scientific distinction, between human beings and animals say that human beings are the only animals that look up. Other animals are always looking down, but human beings have the ability to look up. And so we don't know if other animals have any scientific inquiry or whether they just sort of respond to their environment without thinking about it much. But we know that human beings always, from the time a child is born, it begins to experiment with the world around it. It looks at the world and wants to know what this is. One of the wonderful things about babies, one of several wonderful things about a baby, is that they look at the world with such big, wide open eyes, just looking in wonder at everything. And if we think back to our own childhood, how much more intense our experiences of the world were when we were children. The senses were so sharp. Everything, tastes, smells, tactile sense, sounds, sights, everything elicited a sense of wonder. And so humanity, from humanity's childhood, from humanity's infancy, historically speaking, has been interested in what is this? And that is the root of all scientific endeavor. We have what we call modern science, which started in Italy with the Renaissance. Some date it to Galileo, various ways of deciding when modern science began. But modern science is only a subcategory of the scientific pursuit. Ancient India had science, ancient China had science, the Native Americans had science, cave dwellers had science, again, because they were trying to understand what this is and how to make all of this work for their own happiness. So not only science has existed from the beginning, but technology has existed from the beginning. What modern science brought was really a very focused and deliberate and intentional method of searching for the truth about all of this, what the nature of this is, and how to manipulate it. That's all that it was. It was just a more focused and more intentional method, combined with the ability to collate information, store information, compare information with others over, at first over countrywide, and then over continent-wide, and then worldwide, people who are doing the same sort of research. And so that only is an intensification of an effort that has gone on since the beginning of time. So all societies have had science, and all societies have had religion as well. The earliest signs of humanity, of what we think of as modern human beings, going back now 300,000 years ago, up until recently it was 200,000 years ago, but now they've found skeletal remains in Africa of that date 300,000 years ago. You find that there have been signs of religious activity from the beginning. And all through human society, the signs of religious activity. As Arnold Toynbee, the great British historian, whom many of you know of or have heard of at least, he said that it's only in modern times, in the 20th century, that any society has tried to found itself on intentionally non-spiritual, non-religious foundations. That all societies until the 20th century founded themselves on a religious foundation of one sort or another. And so religion has been central to humanity's life since the beginning, just as science has been a part of humanity's life from the very beginning. I went to the Soviet Union in 1968, spring. It was during Easter vacation in the school I was attending in Stockholm. And so I went with the University of Stockholm to the Soviet Union. They had a tour, and I thought that'd be exciting. Very few people from America went to the Soviet Union in those days. And so a new experience, so I signed up and went along. And we were there. We went to what was then Leningrad. Now it's back to St. Petersburg, its pre-revolutionary name, and to Moscow. And in Moscow, we were in Moscow for several days, for a week, which included Easter. So on Easter Sunday, they told us, well, this morning we have something special. We're going to take you to Lenin's tomb on the Easter morning, Sunday morning. So we went to Lenin's tomb, the mausoleum in the Red Square, and there was a line more than a mile long of people carrying Easter lilies to lay at the tomb of Lenin. And so in that and in many other ways, I saw that even societies that tried to found themselves on atheistic principles, they substituted a made-up religion. And you can see that in many ways. It was visible in the Soviet Union, it's visible in China, it's visible in North Korea, that they substitute the images of religion with communist heroes. And they worship their communist heroes. In Nazi Germany, I had a friend, he's still alive, I think, but I lost track of him 30 years or so ago, who was German by birth. His family was German from as far back as they could trace, many centuries. And he had an uncle who was an advisor to Hitler during the Third Reich. And this uncle's work as an advisor to Hitler he was a Sanskritist, a Sanskrit scholar. And my friend was a Sanskrit scholar also. And so this advisor, his work was to advise Hitler on symbology for the Third Reich, because they were trying to substitute a new religion. Of course, that's where the swastika came from and other symbols came from. Why? They were against Christianity. They imprisoned many Christian priests and others, but they realized that you cannot motivate human beings without at least a quasi-religious element. And so they tried to form their own symbolic world in order to hold their work together. So again, all of that's to say that even in societies in the 20th century, which tried to found themselves on anti-religious basis, even they had to turn to religious symbolism in order to motivate people. So science and religion both go back to the beginning of humanity, and they continue today. So why did science and religion become enemies in relatively modern times? From an Indian standpoint, you can call them just plain modern times, because the 1500s in Italy, when Galileo lived, that is quite modern by Indian standards. If you tell an American that in modern times Galileo did such and such, people say, you don't know your history very well. It would be like the speech the other day where someone, I won't mention, talked about the Revolutionary War where they took over the airports. But from an Indian standpoint, the 1500s is quite modern. And so why at that time, which is modern from a historical standpoint also, not just an Indian standpoint. If for a historian, the 1500s are the beginnings of modernity as we know it. And so why did science and religion turn against each other at that time? One of the reasons is, of course, that from Galileo's time itself, science began, as they began to look at the universe, trying to figure out what it is and how it works. They began to find, one by one, ways in which what they found conflicted with the religious story that had been told. For instance, the idea that the earth is round, that itself was a problem for some, not for everyone in the religious world, but for some. It certainly was a problem when it was found that the earth was not at the center of the universe. It was thought that the earth was God's special creation and that the heavens were made to circle around the earth. And so that threw religion into a tailspin. The idea that the earth is not at the center of the universe. The idea that there are other planets on which there might be life. That also was unacceptable. When Christopher Columbus came to the Americas and discovered that there were people already living here, then the big question for Christianity was, do they have souls? Because they're not mentioned in the Bible. They're not, and the Bible is the book of God in which all knowledge is recorded in the Bible. And the Bible doesn't mention these people. And so did God create them without souls? That was a huge question. It sounds ridiculous to us today, but it was because of these things that again and again, scientific discoveries or accidental discoveries like the discovery of the Americas. As people reached out into the universe and began to look and explore and inquire, they found that the story which had been told by religion was different from what they found in the world at large. Now, the things that were discovered by science, those were not contrary in any way to the teachings of Jesus, speaking about Christianity specifically, because that's where the conflict began between Christianity and religion. There was nothing that was discovered which went against the teachings of Jesus. But Christianity is not just the teachings of Jesus. There's a whole world of thought which has grown up around the teachings of Jesus, and that's where the problems came. The idea of original sin, the idea of evolution came as a great shock to people, something that even now, so many people in a country like America, where there's widespread education, so many people don't accept evolution. There are even people who say that God intentionally spread dinosaur bones around in order to confound atheists. That's why there are dinosaur bones found around the world, because God just he wanted to confound the atheists because they were atheists. So it was God getting back at them. And so again, science discovered over and over again, but through their inquiries, that there were these conflicts between the religious story and the scientific story. Coming for a moment to India, the problem in India was not so great when the European powers came and began to colonize India and began to teach science. For several reasons. One reason was that in India there was so much mythology, so many stories, that the stories had relativized mythology itself. In the West, it was believed that A cannot be B and B cannot be C. That there was a mutual exclusion of ideas. And so if A is true, B can't be true. Whereas in India, it was recognized from ancient times that there are many different ways of expressing the truth, that no one way can capture the whole of truth. And so there are many different stories in the Indian scriptures themselves about creation. In Christianity, there was the 6 days of creation, the seventh day of God's rest, the lineage of kings, and so forth. But in India, first of all, they spoke in terms of billions of years in the scriptures. They spoke about an infinite universe. They spoke about endless creation and so forth. And then there were so many stories of creation itself. My father once asked me many years ago, many decades ago, he asked, do you have a myth about creation as we have in Christianity? And so I said, Dad, which one do you want? We've got many myths about creation. Nothing that's like Genesis exactly, but there are many stories about creation. It's the dance of Kali, it's the dance of Shiva, it's Prajapati, who said, Ekoham Bahusyam Prajayeya. I am one. I wish to be many. Let me project myself forth into the manifold. Or the story in the Purusha Sukta in the Rig Veda about the sacrifice of the cosmic Purusha. There's so many. So there's a story of the well-known story of the lotus growing out of the navel of Vishnu, opening, and then there's Chaturmukhi Brahma, the four-headed Brahma, seated in the lotus, and he four heads to show he's looking in all directions, and he dreams the universe into being. So which one is true? Which one is true? There are many stories about Ganesha, how Ganesha got his elephant head. So which one is true? Which is true? When you have so many stories about everything, then it has to be recognized that they're all attempts to express something which is inexpressible. And so it relativizes the mythology. But in the West, that wasn't true. Christianity had one story that was told in the Bible, and it was to be accepted as it's given in the Bible. And yes, people gradually, many people, intelligent people, they came to an accommodation to science. But there are many who didn't come to that accommodation, and that I'll talk about a little bit also. So one of the things that caused the conflict in the West between religion and science is that scientists began to find things that were in conflict with the stories that they had been told. And so they began to see that, well, I have the evidence of my eyes, and these people are telling me stories that they've heard from their ancestors that don't match what I see with my own eyes. So which should I believe? And the other reason, main reason, the two main reasons are this, plus the fact that religion began to persecute science. Religious authorities through the Inquisition and later other means, they began to persecute those who taught that which was different from the stories of religion. The religion tried to suppress scientific inquiry. And a reason why all of this happened is that religion had been taught in the West as story, not as principle. And if you look at most of the religions of the world, even now, most of them are taught as story. This is our story. This is what happened. You accept our story and you belong to us. There's an interesting story about an American anthropologist who was researching the Native Americans, their culture and beliefs and so forth back in the early 20th century. I've never been able to find out if it's true or if it's apocryphal, but it doesn't matter for our purposes because it's quite possibly true, and it's the idea which is presented which is important. She went to study a certain tribe in the northern Midwest, in the Dakotas, I believe it was. I heard it was. And she heard that there was this old man of the tribe who was the holder of their wisdom. And so she went to him and asked him to tell his creation stories and other stories of the tribe. And so he began to tell her the stories of their tradition. And so at one point she said, but this that you said, that doesn't make any sense because of such and such. And he said, well, if you don't like that story, you make up your own story. And he didn't, as the story was related, it was not that he was being sarcastic. He just meant that this is our story. It's meaningful to us. Other tribes have their stories. You find a story which is meaningful to you. And so the idea is that the myths of a religion, they're meant to express truths. But there's a great difference between a mythic expression of truth and a philosophical expression of truth. And so the problem came because people mistook mythic stories meant to express certain truths, took them as history. Myth is not history. Myth is like poetry. Myth is a way, the mind, the higher mind, the deeper mind, coming from the depths of the mind, a way of expressing truth in the form of a story. When a myth says in the beginning, it doesn't mean in the beginning of time. It means the first principle, the first thing out of which everything else comes. It doesn't have to be in time. When God created the earth, it doesn't mean that there was a time when God created the earth. I mean, the creation is constantly going on. Creation is constantly springing out of the divine being. And so in the beginning just means the first principle, that which the things have come from, not in a temporal sense, but in a philosophical sense. And so another thing that helped India, as far as the accommodation of science with religion, was that from the time of the Upanishads, they were interested in principles. They didn't ask, in the early Vedas they did, but by the time of the Upanishads, they didn't ask who made all of this and why did he make it and how do we worship him and where do we find him and so forth. No, they said, what is this? What is this? If I, with a mind intensified by meditation, if I look into the heart of this universe, what do I find? If I, with a mind which has been trained in meditation, look into the depths of myself, what do I find? What do I discover? What are the principles of life? What are the principles of existence? What is existence itself? Not who is the divine being who came and made it out of this stuff or that stuff and how many days it took him to make it. No. But what is existence itself? What is consciousness itself? What is the self itself? What is the world? What is my relationship to the world? These are all principle-based questions. And there, as we'll see, there's not the conflict with science there. The conflict comes when you have a story. So it's not that India escaped it altogether. Shankaracharya said more than 1,100, 1,200 years ago, he said that the purpose of the scriptures, the Vedas, including the Upanishads, is to teach about that which cannot be perceived by the senses, the supersensuous truth, transcendental truth. If, he says, if your senses and reason say something about this world which is different from the scriptures, accept your sense data. Because the purpose of the scriptures is not to tell about this world, it's to tell about the ultimate reality. And so the scriptures, he says, they describe the creation of the world just in order to relate this world to the ultimate reality. That's the purpose of describing creation. It's not to say that this is what creation is. For that, use your senses and use your intelligence. And so that also was there in the tradition. But as I said, it's not that India escaped completely. There's one modern and very famous, I won't mention his name, though some of you will figure it out, a very famous teacher that came to the West. He said that the scientists have been fooled again by God, just like the Christians, some Christians, fundamentalists say that God spread dinosaur bones in order to confound the atheists. So he said that the Srimad Bhagavat Purana says that the Surya Loka, the world of the sun, is closer to the earth than Chandra Loka. And so scientists have been deluded into thinking that the sun is further from the earth than the moon is. No, actually the sun is closer to the earth than the moon is. Well, that's ridiculous. That's absurd. All respects to the great teacher who said that, but that's completely unacceptable. And a person who accepts it because somebody said it is to be felt sorry for. If you are so foolish as to say, oh, then actually the sun is closer to the earth than the moon. Oh, I also was one of those who was deluded into thinking that. Oh, I'm so glad you corrected me. Oh no, that's your foolishness for accepting such ridiculous information. And again, the person who said that, he was not a bad person. It's just that he took his stand, like all fundamentalists do, on the words of the scripture. He also, the same person, said that modern science talks about so many, and I forget what the figure is, but so many species of plants and animals. But the Srimad Bhagavat Purana says that there were only 84,000 species. And so that's the actual number of species in the world. Scientists are again deluded. Well, no. How can you be so foolish as to say, well, yeah, oh, is the Srimad Bhagavat said 84,000, especially when 84,000 was a symbolic number. As well, wasn't that the sages of the Srimad Bhagavat went out and counted all of the bacteria and the fungi and the plants and the animals and so forth? No. It's possible in any religious tradition to be a fundamentalist, and that's what we want to avoid if we're thinking people. So I've explained why it was that science had trouble with religion. Why did religion have trouble with science? Or why has religion had trouble with science? And especially, again, in the West more particularly, where this struggle has been the most intense. One thing is that science seemed to destroy the basis of belief. If you have this belief and you recognize that your belief is in something sacred, something holy, something which is life-giving, something which is inspiring, something which motivates you to a higher life, and then someone comes and says, that's all bosh, that's all nonsense, that everything that you and for 2,000 years people have based their life upon, it's all nonsense because science can prove it's nonsense, then of course you're going to react. When you see that science doesn't talk about values, it doesn't tell you what the purpose of life is. Some scientists will. They'll say, well, it's to learn about the universe so we can manipulate it and make ourselves happy. But if you see through that and see that that's not a sufficient goal for a good person, that there has to be something more to life than just learning how to manipulate matter so that you can get some pleasure for a few years and then you die and everything's gone, well, then no, you recognize that no, science has missed something. That at least in religion I had a sense of the sacred. At least in religion I had a sense of purpose. And at least in religion I had a sense of values. At least in religion I knew why I was supposed to be good, why I was supposed to be truthful, why I was supposed to be unselfish, why I was supposed to care for others. And science comes and says the whole foundation of that is wrong, and they don't provide anything else. They don't provide anything which provides for those higher values of humanity. So it destroyed the basis of belief, and there was the recognition among religious people that it has destroyed something which is of extraordinary value without replacing it. Without replacing it. Again, there were many scientific thinkers who tried to replace it, the utilitarians. But as Swami Vivekananda showed, from a utilitarian standpoint, there's no basis for why I should be a good person. I may be unreligious, I may be an atheist, and I may be a good person. But that's one thing, accepting that I am a good person and that I am an atheist at the same time. But you cannot show, because it's intrinsically impossible to show, not because some religious book said so, but because it's intrinsically impossible to show that there is a basis for being good if there is nothing more than just matter here. It's impossible to show why you should be good. Yes, everybody accepts that there are many atheists who are good people, but that's different from saying that they're good people because they're atheists. No, that doesn't follow. It doesn't follow at all. So religious people recognize that. Science has a materialistic basis. It began with the idea that all of this is real. This is real. And then many scientists went further than that and said that this is the only reality. That matter, that which can be measured, is the only reality. And so religious people reacted against that, and rightly so. Why? How can you say that only that which can be measured is real? What is the basis of that? All of your higher emotions, all of your higher sentiments, all of your higher thoughts, they can't be measured. They're not subject to quantification. And so science has no answer for that, except that, well, all of that is just bosh, that's just superstition, get rid of it. So that also worked against the idea of accepting science wholeheartedly from the religious side. So now let me say a few words about how different people and groups of people have responded to this apparent conflict between religion and science. Some did it, of course, some scientific minds did it by rejecting religion altogether. Some religious minds did it by rejecting science altogether and saying that, no, give me that old-time religion. There's an old fundamentalist hymn. Give me that old-time religion. It's good enough for it was good enough for Jesus. It's good enough for me. So, meaning I don't care about all your science. I don't care about your dating of dinosaur bones. I don't care about your research into the universe and all of that. None of that matters, because my Bible tells me that this world was created in 6 days, and on the seventh day God takes rest. And everybody but ministers like me are supposed to take rest on the seventh day. Some religious people rejected science. Some scientific people rejected religion. But there are others who accept science, and have been others from the beginning. Like Galileo, he was a religious man. Almost all of the early scientists, they were religious. And they were not comfortable with the conflict that they came into with the church. But they couldn't disbelieve their eyes. That which they were seeing, how could they say, no, that I don't see it? You're seeing it. And so they were uncomfortable, but they were still religious. And so from that time, from the beginnings of modern science to the present, there have been people who accept science and yet recognize the value of religion. And so they come to some accommodation, some of them by compartmentalizing their minds. And I used to see this in the church I grew up in as a kid. I found my first book on Vedanta and came in this direction when I was 17. But until that time, I saw the people in our church, good people, and people who worked in science and technology. I had a Sunday school teacher, a wonderful man, a Scottish man, who was a scientist and also our Sunday school teacher. And he had come to his own accommodation of religion and science. And he did it by saying that I believe that God is ultimate reality. And that sounds very much like Vedanta, that God is ultimate reality. Other people that I saw and that I've read about and that I myself have known, they do it by compartmentalizing. When I'm in the scientific field, I think scientifically. When I'm in the religious field, I put science aside and I think religiously. But that does harm to the psyche. That's not a good accommodation. That does harm to the psyche. If you're believing one thing on Sunday, and then Monday through Friday when you're at work, you're believing something that's contradicting that, and on Saturday you don't believe anything because it's time to watch football, then you're doing harm to yourself. If truth is truth, then there has to be some connection between the two. So there's some, again, who learned to accept the myths, as stories that were made up to explain higher truths. Truths that could be expressed philosophically, but they were expressed mythologically in terms of stories, because that way also truth is expressed. For instance, if you say that this universe is, taking a Hindu example, is the dance of Shiva, that's a beautiful way of looking at the universe. And for those of you who read, it came out many decades, 40 years, 45 years ago, it must be now more than 45 years ago, The Tao of Physics by Fritjof Capra. It was one of the first books that really looked at the interface between spirituality and religion. He was a physicist, probably still alive, I imagine. He still is a physicist, I guess. But he said that that was a wonderful way of looking at this universe, that it's the dance of Shiva. Now, he was a scientist. He wasn't saying that, no, there's actually no matter and there are no subatomic particles. It's actually just Shiva dancing around. No, but he saw that this infinite universe, which is never still, even mountains and stones are intensely active every moment. That this is the dance of Shiva, and it's a beautiful way of expressing it. And so in front of the CERN laboratory, as many of you know, there's I think it's at least 6 feet tall, maybe taller, a huge Nataraja in Switzerland, in front of the laboratory, in recognition of the beautiful expression of the scientific truth that this universe is a dynamic universe. And so some came to an accommodation by that, by accepting stories as stories. Adam and Eve was not meant to say that there was actually an Adam and an Eve who actually lived in a garden, and that garden was on this place on the earth between the Tigris and the Euphrates, and God actually planted a tree there and said, don't eat from the fruit of this tree, of course making them want to eat from the true fruit of this tree. If he had never told them about it, then they wouldn't have eaten from it. But God himself is to blame for all of the sin entering into the world. So as a story, it expresses truths. As history, it's awful history, terrible history. It's not history at all. And so some accepted it as myths. Some accept the limitations of science and realize that, well, if I want values, I go to religion because science doesn't deal with that. And some have taken up religions like Buddhism and Advaita Vedanta, non-dualistic Vedanta, because there they find that they can be fully scientific and fully spiritual as well. So let me say a word about Vivekananda's contribution. One of the things was that, as he taught, and as should be obvious, he pointed out that both are searches for truth. The problem with religion is that, especially in the West, not exclusively in the West, but in a more deliberate and obvious way in the West, religion was always taught as a doctrine which had to be believed. Religion was something that you were supposed to believe in. If you didn't believe in it, you were a bad person and you went to hell. And so there was the threat of hell if you didn't believe it, and so you're supposed to believe it so you can avoid going to hell. That's not a motivation to direct a person towards the search for truth. What does that have to do with the search for truth? That's just fear-baiting people, just telling people that you have to believe it because we say so, and if you don't believe it, you're going to go to hell. And so I grew up hearing people and knowing people, not in my family, but outside the family and society and at church, saying that, well, I believe in God because I figure it's a good insurance policy. Because if there is no God and I die, then that didn't hurt anything. But if I die and there was a God and I didn't believe in him, then I'm going to hell. So better to believe in God. Well, what kind of mind does that produce? What kind of pitiful mind does that produce? Weak-minded people, chicken-livered, weak-minded people it produces. That's no basis for a higher life. And so both are searches for truth, but in different directions. The scientist begins by taking this universe for granted. It exists as my senses reveal it. And then they examine it, they analyze it, they experiment with it, they play with it, because experimentation is playing. Our problem as adults is that we forget how to play. We take everything serious. But no, experimentation means playing. That's what children are doing from the time they're born. Children are playing with the world. That's what we should do also. And so that is the motivation behind science. What is all of this that I see? So trying to come to the bottom of it. And religion is looking for that which is the deepest within me. Let me search, and this was only expressed clearly in Hinduism, in Vedanta, in Buddhism as well, but even more clearly in Hinduism, that the search for the truth, if I don't know the truth within myself, I can't know truth out here. It's impossible. Because why? Because what I see outside is a function of my self-understanding. It's everything that I see is seen through the lens of my own mind. Everything that I see is painted by my own mind. And so if I don't know who the painter is behind all of the paintings, then how can I hope to know what this out here is? And so religion is a search for the depth dimension within us and also outside. With a mind trained in meditation, the ancient sages looked into the depths of external nature and into the depths of themselves. They weren't looking for what is this table made out of? What is this stuff we call sand? What is this stuff we call rock? What is this thing we call a plant? What is this thing we call an animal, and how does it work? No, they weren't looking for that. What is at the root of everything? What is at the heart of everything? What is existence itself? What is this? Everything appears within my consciousness, but what is consciousness? I know that I'm conscious, but I have no idea what consciousness is. So what is consciousness? I know that I am, but what does it mean that I am? What does it mean to exist? What is existence? And so religion was a search for the depth dimension. Science was a search for what is this that we perceive with the senses. And so that's why science has, it doesn't have to have, but why modern science has a prejudice in favor of materialism. Because they started by looking at this external stuff and what is it? And so naturally, that's what they take as real and most important. It doesn't have to do that, science, but that's what the beginning point of it, and so that's where they end up. So Swami Vivekananda said that science and religion are both looking at the same thing. They're both looking at the same thing. We're seeing the same world. We're seeing the same thing, but looking in different directions for an answer. And Swamiji further said that both are good. Both are helpful to human progress. Both are helpful to human understanding. There doesn't need to be a quarrel between the two. Swamiji said that in the future that religion and science will shake hands, using, of course, a Western metaphor, because he was speaking in the West. They'll shake hands. Or maybe in India they'll do namaste to each other. But that they would come together, because in time they would recognize that they were both seeking truth. One is, the approaches diverge. But it's only an approach. One is seeking it in the external world. What is this that I perceive? The other is seeking in the internal world. One is based on common sense. I accept the world of common sense, and how does it work? Another is based on seeking the unseen. that which I don't see, that which is unseen and transcendental. How do I get to that? The source of the seen. One seeks to understand the world in its own terms, and another seeks the source of everything, the source of everything. And because it was through Scripture that the source of everything was revealed and handed down to people from generation to generation, people looked to, religious people generally looked to Scripture. So again, Swamiji felt that there was a possibility of coming together of the two, on the one hand by evolution of the scientific pursuit itself. He felt that science would eventually come to a point where they begin to see that physics is melting into metaphysics. That you come to a point of analysis where you find that the universe of the senses, the universe of common sense, is melting away into a metaphysical reality. And that's already happened, especially in fields like theoretical physics. That has already happened, where the universe of common sense has disappeared. Much of what modern theoretical physics talks about is, from a common sense standpoint, nonsense. And yet it's based on the evidence of analysis. I don't mean that it's really nonsense, but it's nonsense from the standpoint of common sense. Just like this solid table, well, it's not solid at all. It's mostly just empty space with some tiny infinitesimal electrical charges in relationship to each other, but most of it is just empty space. It's not solid at all. It's wavicles and mostly empty space with vastly far apart wavicles. That's all that it is. Yet it feels so solid. And so in other ways also, the common sense world has disappeared in modern scientific research. So Swamiji felt that as that went forward, scientists would begin to find, and there are more and more scientists who are finding that, again, at the cutting edge of science. Not that they've come to solid conclusions at the cutting edge, as cutting edge because they're always pushing the frontiers further into the unknown. But they are coming to a point where the world of common sense is disappearing and the metaphysical world is appearing. As I said some time ago in another lecture here, when I was 13 or 14, I forget which, I was right between the two ages, I came across a book in our junior high school bookstore that I bought called The Universe and Dr. Einstein by Lincoln Barnett. It was this was published back in the 1950s, and it was a popularization of Einstein's relativity theories and the two theories. And in that, one of the things I still remember, it made a deep impression on my young mind at that time. I never forgot it, and several other things in it also I have always remembered. I recognized later that that was part of my spiritual search. It said that the further physics has delved into the nature of the external world, the more they found that the universe as fact has disappearing, and as idea, it's beginning to appear more like idea than like physical fact. And so that, again, that was back in the 50s when he wrote that, that modern physics is showing that the universe is more idea than physical fact. And so that was what Swamiji was talking about, that science coming to the point where the physical facts begin to disappear into metaphysical principles. And he felt that that would happen much more as time went on. So there is the possibility of the two coming together, because matter has been dematerialized and the external world is no longer taken for granted as a real common sense world. And again, especially in theoretical physics. Of course, there's the well-known idea now that the observer, the scientific idea that you can be purely objective, and that there's an objective world, and that you, as a scientist, look and experiment with the external world, but you are completely detached. But no, the idea in modern physics is that the observer affects the observed, that you impact that which you experiment upon. So Again, Swamiji felt that the two would come together, and he felt that these were some of the indications of ways that they would come together. So how can spirituality help science? And then I'll take the opposite point before we conclude. One of the things that science can help religion with, and these are things that Swami Vivekananda pointed to also back in the 19th century, is that science removes the superstition from religion. It clarifies that which is story from that which is fact. And so it can help to clarify the mind, to get rid of superstitions, to get rid of the cobwebs in the mind, free the mind from prejudice. It can help to free the mind from lower emotions. When you realize that when I'm doing, just as an example, when I'm working with something, say I'm working with a tool or something, and what I want to do with the tool is just not working, it keeps breaking, and I get mad with the tool and I get mad with the thing, from a scientific standpoint, how ridiculous that is. There's some reason why the tool is not working and why I'm not able to do it. Look into the reason for it. Look into the cause. Things happen because of causes, cause and effect. So instead of getting angry with the tool and throwing it down, this is a useless screwdriver or a useless drill or something. Well, no, I'm doing something wrong because there's a causation involved. Let me figure out what is wrong. And so free the mind from lower emotions and, let me back up a minute and say how science can help spirituality, because I mixed the two topics up. It's religious spirituality which can help us with getting rid of the lower emotions. So one thing again is it gets rid of superstition. It also keeps us honest, because in religion we're talking about things which are transcendental, things that you can't see with the eyes. You can realize them, but that realization is difficult and it takes a lifetime. And so most people don't attain to a high state of realization. And so it's easy for a person to claim revelation which is just made up. And that happens all the time in religion. People who claim to have had realization, who claim to have had enlightenment, who claim to have heard the voice of God telling them to do such and such a thing. And so science can help to keep religion honest so that we don't go out making all sorts of claims that God told me that the end of the world is next week and everybody should come to me and empty all of their bank accounts into my account, which is going to go to God, and so forth. No. Scientific skepticism is good. Once you know something is true, then give up skepticism. Don't keep doubting just because it's a habit of mind, but don't believe something until you know that it's true. And so science helps there. It destroys superstition. And Swami Vivekananda wanted science to imbue religion with its spirit, meaning Swamiji saw that Vedanta inherently was, and it had moved away from that over the millennia, but it inherently was and should once again be experimental and experiential. That spirituality should be experimental and experiential. Spirituality, also like science, is experimental. Let me see, I'm trying to meditate. Meditation isn't working. Let me try to figure out how to make it work. Let me try to refine my technique. Try to figure out how to focus the mind. Let me see by this practice what its effects on me are. That is, it's experimental. Let me try this. It's experiential. What can I experience through this discipline? And so Swamiji wanted it to be experiential, experimental. And also one of the qualities of modern science is it seeks the explanation of a thing in the thing itself. And he wanted that to be the way of religion, which it is in Vedanta already. What that means is a scientist doesn't ask what divine being made this rock and how did he or she make the rock. No, what is the rock itself? Let me examine the rock itself. So the scientist doesn't ask, well, what divine being made this plant and how did they make it? No, what is this plant? Let me look at the plant itself. Let me look at this planet itself. Let me look at this clod of earth itself. Let me look at this animal itself. Let me look at this phenomenon itself. And what is it? So science seeks the explanation for a thing within itself. And he said religion should do the same. And that's what Vedanta from the beginning did. It sought I know that I'm conscious, but I can't grasp what consciousness itself is. What is consciousness? As I said before, I know that I am, but I don't know what that means, to be. What does it mean to be? What is existence? What does that mean? I experience time, the flow of change, but what is time itself? I experience space, but what is space itself? And so to seek the explanation of a thing within itself, that's what Vedanta always did. Not who are the divine beings or divine being who made things and why did they make them and how many days did it take to make them? And did he make it out of nothing or did he make it out of something or did he have a laboratory or whatever? No, to seek reality itself, in the thing itself. And so these are some of the ways in which science can help spirituality. And how can spirituality help science? There also it can help free the mind from prejudice. The prejudice that this material universe is real. Science itself has shown that the universe is not real as we see it. And yet science continues to teach that this is the only reality. Science has shown that the mind affects our perception of reality, and yet it still has the idea of an objective reality outside of the mind that the mind can experience. Science has shown through the study of neurophysiology and the way that the senses work that what I'm perceiving is not an external world. I'm perceiving the mind's reaction to something. All that I perceive is produced in my own mind. Now, science says it comes because of information coming through the senses, but what I actually perceive is not an external world. I perceive the mind's reaction. All that I see is, I can't see anything outside of my own mind, even when I think I am. No, the whole world that I'm perceiving, and that's a scientific fact, is I'm only perceiving that which is within my own mind. Now, science will say that, yes, they have to admit that it's true because it's founded on their own analysis, that idea. But they'll say that, yes, but the best explanation for why we see the world we do is that there is an external world which is coming through the senses and then the mind is reacting and then we're perceiving the mind's reaction. And so that's the best explanation. But they have to accept that we don't see an external world. We're perceiving the mind's representation of something that we think is an external world. And so spirituality can itself help science free itself from some of its superstitions. The belief in an external matter, that the external matter is real as it is experienced. No, it's not. And science should know that, but they continue to act as if it's true. It frees the mind from lower emotions also, the spirituality, because it says that in order to perceive the truth, I have to free the mind from lower emotions. I have to make the mind clear. I have to make the mind, yes, love and compassion and those things are to be cultivated. But hatred, jealousy, and all such lower emotions, they have to be controlled in order to perceive spiritual truth. And if I can perceive, if I can clarify my mind of lower emotions, then even this world begins to look different. The world itself, I begin to see the world with clearer eyes. And that's what the scientist wants, is to understand things clearly. You can't understand things clearly when the mind is clouded with lower emotions. So spirituality helps to establish the mind in calmness. And it's only the calm mind which can perceive reality as it is. The disturbed mind can't perceive it. And so the spirituality helps with the calming of the mind. It helps with the concentration of the mind. All knowledge, as Swami Vivekananda says, all knowledge that we have comes through concentration of the mind. And religion deals with the science of concentrating the mind. And spirituality gives us a much vaster perspective than modern science, which is just interested in little things here, taking little things apart, making widgets and so forth. No, the spirituality gives a much larger perspective. So in conclusion, let me just say, because time is already more than up, Meister Eckhart, the great German Christian mystic, who is also an Advaita Vedantin. Not that he knew anything about Advaita Vedanta, though he did know about Sufi mystics and quoted them. So this was back in the 13th and 14th centuries in Germany. But he was the one who is closest in the Christian world to Shankaracharya and to the Advaita philosophy. He said that truth is a thing so noble that if God himself could depart from truth, I would follow truth and leave God behind. The truth is a thing so noble that if God himself could depart from truth, I would leave God and follow truth. Now, for Meister Eckhart, what that meant was not said lightly, meaning that, I found out that the Bible has all kinds of stories and I don't need to believe in them, so I'm going to leave religion. No, but the truth is the most important thing. God is God only if God is truth. Only if God is truth. So follow truth. That's what Vedanta was interested in. Sister Nivedita said about Swami Vivekananda that with him one felt that the only reason he was a promoter of the Vedanta philosophy is because that's where he found the clearest expression of truth. But it was truth that she said, it was truth that Swami Vivekananda was interested in. It wasn't because it was his family tradition. It wasn't because it was somebody told him. It wasn't because it was in books somewhere. But it was because it was the clearest expression of truth. And finally, let me just mention that in spirituality also, as in science, we can start with a minimum working hypothesis. Science begins not by accepting everything as true, but begins with a working hypothesis. This seems to be true. This seems to be rational. This seems like it should be this way. So let me test it. Let me find out if this is true. And so religion can be followed in the same way. That reading about great souls and reading about their tremendous lives, their wonderful lives, their inspiring lives, the tremendous good that they did to humanity, then that gives me faith that they were on to something. And if they said that such and such is true, then let me seek in that direction also. And so let me take up religion as a working hypothesis and work with it and try it. Even something like prayer. I think, well, prayer, what good is that? For a scientific mind, there's nothing to prayer. But no, if you take up something like prayer just as a minimum working hypothesis and you begin to practice it, you find the strange thing happening, that prayer itself brings faith, that yes, it's working. I don't get an answer. I don't hear a voice on the other side of my prayer. And yet I begin to feel that someone is listening. Some vast intelligence and some warm and loving intelligence is listening to my prayer. And that calls me to pray more because I feel that there's a response. Even if I'm not getting answers that I want, but no, I begin to feel that someone is listening. If I do japa, the repetition of a mantra, with minimum working hypothesis, I begin to find, it takes a long time, but yes, I begin to find that it works. It works. It's bringing me great benefit that I didn't have before. And so, in conclusion, religion and science don't need to be enemies at all. It's possible to lead an authentic scientific life and an authentic spiritual life. Because our search should be for truth. Let us seek truth in whichever direction, in whatever way we want. Give the scientists freedom to pursue truth in the scientific field. Give religious people freedom to pursue truth in the religious field. And let both of them communicate because each of them will help the other. Both sides need the other because both sides are subject to the natural prejudices of the human mind. And if both are pursued together, you find that both of them minimize the prejudice of the other side. So with that, I'll conclude. I'm sorry I didn't leave time for question and answer because it's already long after time was supposed to be up. So I'll close here. Let me give a closing chant, and then you'll have to ask that later, Jay. I'll give a closing chant and then the arati. Om madhuvatharitayate madhuksharandhi sindhavaha madhvirna santoshadhihi Madhunaktamuto shasi madhumatparthivagum rajaha madhudyorastu pita madhumandho vanaspatir madhumagum astu suryaha madhvirgavo bhavantunaha. Om Madhu, Om Madhu, Om Madhu. For us who seek the truth, and for all living beings, may the winds blow sweetly. May the rivers flow sweetly. May the herbs yield us sweetness. Sweet be the night and the break of day. Sweet be the very dust of the earth. May the heavens pour forth sweetness upon us. May the trees, lords of the forest, bear us sweetness. May the sun shed its sweetness upon us. May all the directions pour forth sweetness. Om, sweetness, sweetness, sweetness. So for announcements, on Tuesday we'll have the